There are 106 brawlers in Brawl Stars, and in this video, I'm gonna be looking at the worst thing about every brawler. Starting with Shelly. The worst thing about Shelly is that she's a close-range brawler without the tank's health and the traits, so most of the time you're just gonna be stuck in bushes. The worst thing about Colt is that you can never deal your main attacks full damage because of the multiple projectiles, and also his main attack is very thin, which makes it very easy to dodge. The worst thing about Bull is that enemies most of the time can easily run away from your super, and you'll get punished if you miss. The worst thing about Brock is that his super is very situational. It deals a lot of damage, yes, but most of the time it's easily dodgeable. The worst thing about Barley is being jumped by an Edgar or Mortis, and you're pretty much cooked, even if you use your slowing gadget. The worst thing about Nita is using your bear super and having to use your stun gadget, which needs good timing, but Bruce dies immediately anyway. The worst thing about El Primo is waiting to charge your super by getting bullied, which will take ages, just to be easily dodged by someone and getting bullied even more. The worst thing about Poco is his second gadget. That's literally useless 90% of the time. The worst thing about Rosa is that you are a supercharging machine for the enemy team. And Rosa doesn't have something to approach enemies like El Primo or Bull, and she doesn't get any speed, so your best bet is to just camp in bushes. The worst thing about Rico is his buffies. Just kidding. The worst thing is using your second star power and staying at low health because you want that juicy speed boost and then getting punished for it. The worst thing about Jessie is that she's very vulnerable against assassins, so all it takes is one Edgar jump on you, and all you can do is use your super and pray that you can survive. The worst thing about Dynamite is his main attack delay. That makes him terrible against close-range brawlers that rush you, and you're pretty much dead unless you use a stun gadget or Dynajump super. I honestly can't think of a single bad thing about Daryl except maybe his gadgets being mediocre. The worst thing about Penny is charging your mortar super and it getting destroyed immediately by the enemy thrower. The worst thing about Tick is using your shield gadget to predict that someone will jump on you, but you time it wrong so that it explodes way too early, but at that point, that's just a skill issue. The worst thing about Carl is after charging your super and using it, you get knocked back or stunned by the enemy and your super gets cancelled. I mean, do I even have to talk about this one? The worst thing about 8-Bit is obviously his movement speed. 8-Bit is the slowest brawler in the game, which makes dodging anything impossible. The worst thing about Jackie is her rebuild gadget. And yes, I do in fact like this gadget, and it's very fun to mess around with, but if you're playing competitively, the other gadget is a must. The worst thing about Gus is that his main attacks spawn ghosts far away from you, which means they can be very hard to get. The worst thing about Bo is thinking that you got the best traps that will destroy anyone, but the enemies just bait out all of your traps or simply dash away. The worst thing about Piper is getting jumped on by a close-range brawler and not having your supercharge. Yeah, you're pretty much done. The worst thing about Pam is that she needs to be close range to deal decent enough damage. And even if you are close range, the enemy can just do this and exploit your main attack, and you cannot do anything about it. The worst thing about Frank is getting bullied by any stuns, knockbacks, or any effect, and worst of all is getting your hyper super cancelled. The worst thing about BB is her main attack delay, which can be exploited by many brawlers, and it's just the same with Pam. The worst thing about B is facing any non-brawler object, like a box, Nita's bear, and worst of all, Mr. P's Porter. Ems is a really good brawler, but if I had to say, the worst thing about her is getting outranged by sharpshooters like Piper or Mandy. The worst thing about Gale is his jump pad gadget. That was so fun before, but it got nerfed years ago to this. The worst thing about Nani is that you are completely vulnerable when using your super, and anyone can just attack you. The worst thing about Colette is facing a low health brawler like Crow, that you not only deal pathetic damage to him, but it's impossible to use your super on him since he can just dodge it with his fast movement speed or just super away. The worst thing about Edgar is that I cannot play him in ranked, because each time I think of playing Edgar, he just gets banned by the enemy team. The worst thing about Stu, and I don't know if this is considered a bad thing, but he requires a lot of skill, and most people playing with you, like randoms, are probably trash with him. Honestly, I can't think of a bad thing about Belle, but maybe her super being not as good and very situational. The worst thing about Grom is that he's literally a free kill for most brawlers, because he has no way to gain speed and no ability to escape. So if an Edgar jumps on you, you're dead. The worst thing about Griff is his coin shower gadget that does no damage. The worst thing about Ash is your super being useless because you're against a splash damage brawler like Nita. The worst thing about Lola is that your super gets nerfed while next to you, which is basically the only viable way of using it. The worst thing about Bonnie is staying in your cannon form for way too long, which is stupidly slow and does no damage compared to normal Bonnie. The worst thing about Pam is his pulse repellent gadget, which I'm not joking is literally the worst gadget in the game. The worst thing about Mandy is that you have to to stand still to use her range to its full potential, so some brawlers can counter you like Nani, Barry, or Barley. The worst thing about Maisie is her main attack being slow and getting faster, which is very weird. And I always felt like Maisie's main attack is kinda clunky. The worst thing about Hank is his charging bubble. It's so slow to use, not only do you get revealed in bushes, but you cannot heal at all when charging your bubble. The worst thing about Pearl is her hyper. That's probably the worst designed hyper in the game. It creates a fire area around her and knocks back all enemies, which defeats the whole purpose of the fire area. The worst thing about Larry and Lori is obviously their gadget, Order Swap. The worst thing about Angelo is him being close range with someone and having to spam your main attack, which is like the worst thing that can happen. The worst thing about Barry is his range, which is surprisingly short compared to most throwers. The worst thing about Shade is his jump scare gadget. That is literally one of the worst gadgets in the game. Basically slows down enemies in a very small range, and by small, I mean smaller than Shade's main attack. The worst thing about Meeple is his very low DPS, which makes him unable to kill most brawlers quickly. The worst thing about Trunk is that brawlers can just rush you and you'll deal no damage. The worst thing about Bolt is having bad internet connection. Seriously, the amount of times I lost all my speed using Bolt because of the stupid lag is uncountable, and sometimes it doesn't have to do with my internet connection. It's just bug stars. The worst thing about Mortis is getting the ball passed to you in Brawl Ball in bad situations, like when you have your long dash charged up and it's now wasted. I can't think of a bad thing about Tara, but if I had to nitpick, I think it's her slow reload speed. The worst thing about Jean is that his damage is way too low for 1v1s, and he heavily relies on teammates. The worst thing about Mr. P is getting rushed, since your main attack damage literally becomes half, and he doesn't have a way to escape or speed up from any assassin. The worst thing about Max is that the enemies can use your gadget against you sometimes, which can end horribly. The worst thing about Sprout is just like Mr. P, he has nothing to do in close range. I mean, it's literally impossible to hit anyone in close range using Sprout. And honorable mention, his stupid redesign. The worst thing about Lou is when you get someone to almost get frozen, but he manages to win before you can freeze him. The worst thing about Byron is trying to heal that one teammate that for some reason is the best at dodging all of your healing shots. The worst thing about Ruffs is his second star power, which can increase the max health of brawlers by 30 HP every second. And just like Jackie, this gadget is just fun to mess around with. The worst thing about Squeak is hitting his super on anyone that's not a high save, because most of the time, it's just luck based. The worst thing about Buzz is getting hard countered by most close range brawlers. The worst thing about Fang is using his super to get an easy kill, but it manages to bounce to the wrong target and you're just cooked. The worst thing about Eve is her gadget Motherly Love, which is the worst healing gadget in the game, and it's literally useless compared to the superior gadget. Gotta go. The worst thing about Janet is her super. That's very hard to land shots with without using the hyper. The worst thing about Otis is probably his gadget Dormant Star. That's considered very bad by most people. The worst thing about Buster is his super. Using your super just for the enemy to have a thrower. Also, his shield makes you slower and unable to attack. The worst thing about Gray is his damage, which makes him unable to kill most brawlers with 3 shots. The worst thing about RT is using your super in Showdown. Trust me, most of the time it's gonna end badly, even if you put it in a bush. The worst thing about Willow is that her super is extremely hard to hit for some reason. And the worst feeling is when you charge a hyper super just for it to miss. The worst thing about Doug is using your super and rushing the enemy team just for your hot dog to end a bit early and you're just dead. The worst thing about Chuck is that he's the most situational brawler ever, and 99% of the time you're using him in heist. The worst thing about Charlie is her hyper, which spawns 3 spiders that do absolutely nothing. The worst thing about Miko is after using your super, there is like a very small duration that you cannot do anything. You're stunned and you're completely vulnerable to enemies. The worst thing about Melody is trying to hit her notes. The worst thing about Lily is when you use the Shadow Realm gadget and you don't know where you'll end up. The worst thing about Clancy is that he's useless in the beginning of the match, even more than Surge's first level. The worst thing about Mo is that he's very easy to kill after his super ends. The worst thing about Juju is when you're fighting anyone in a bush and your damage is like cut in half. The worst thing about Ollie is that he can't kill most brawlers because of his very low damage, which makes some matchups impossible to win. The worst thing about Lumi is that when you have your maces thrown away, it can be very slow to get them back. The worst thing about Finks is his super. Yes, it might give you an advantage, but some brawlers either don't get affected by your super, or they can use your super against you, which is very bad. Guys, I swear I spent like 2 hours thinking for a bad thing about Jaeyoung, and I genuinely can't think of anything, so I'll pass. The worst thing about Ellie is that you have to use your main attack very carefully, because it takes ages to reload. The worst thing about Mina is her annoying voice lines. Sorry, but the tone of her voice lines just gives me headaches for some reason. The worst thing about Ziggy is being in close range with any single brawler, which is a nightmare. The worst thing about Gigi is that she has the shortest range in the game. The worst thing about Glowy is that Glowy doesn't actually exist, because the real one is Glowbert. The worst thing about Najia is how hard it is to get your super and hyper. The worst thing about Damien is being useless until you get your super. The worst thing about Starnova is her voice lines. And trust me, I know many brawlers with terrible voice lines, but Starnova takes the cake for the worst voice line in the game. The worst thing about Wendy is that she has the lowest HP in the game, without her shield. The worst thing about Spike is nothing. Spike is the definition of perfection, and there is nothing bad about Spike. The worst thing about Crow is his title, which is the most uncreative title in the game, probably. I can't think of a bad thing for Leon, but I guess it's getting revealed when invisible, especially with poison brawlers like Byron. The worst thing about Sandy is his reliance on his teammates, and not being able to 1v1 most brawlers. The worst thing about Surge is being stuck at level 1, which is the worst pain any human can experience. Thankfully, the star power exists. The worst thing about Ember is when your ammo runs out, and you are forced to attack like this. The worst thing about Meg is having your super in mech form, then going out of the mech form, and going back, and you no longer have your super. The worst thing about Chester is his sneak peek star power. That is practically the worst star power in the game, and doesn't give you any advantage whatsoever. The worst thing about Cordelius is his very short range, I guess. The worst thing about Kit is using your super offensively in any game mode other than solo showdown, which requires a lot of patience. The worst thing about Draco is that enemies can just get inside you and you'll deal no damage. The worst thing about Kenji is his hyper. It used to be way too overpowered by letting you teleport to the enemy, but now it only does the pull. The worst thing about Pierce is playing him in solo showdown. The worst thing about Nori is her super. It doesn't do that much damage and enemies can just run away from it, and they can easily predict where you'll land up, which makes it very bad. The worst thing about Kaze is the credits cost. Just kidding. She's just very complicated because Brawl Stars wanted to make her complicated. The worst thing about Sirius is that his shadows can be countered by any splash damage brawler.
And that's the end. Make sure you subscribe and goodbye.